Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second part of the Yiddish Ecologies conference. My name is Anna Elena Torres, and I'm speaking from Chicago, so I'll begin with an acknowledgement of land and labor. Several Native nations share a connection to this region of Chicago and to one another. These include Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, which are all related Anishinaabe, in addition to Ho-Chunk, Kaskaskia, Kickapoo, Mascoutin, Menominee, Meskwaki, Miamia, Peoria, Sac, and Fox. These nations lived and traveled here long before non-native settlers incorporated Chicago. Today, Chicago boasts one of the largest indigenous populations on the continent. We thank and acknowledge these peoples as well as express our gratitude for the labor which built and maintains this university space. I want to thank my colleagues, Dr. Jessica Kirzane and Chana Toth Sewell, who read the proposals and co-organized the conference together. In the Greenberg Center, Nancy Pardee and Mike Phillips coordinated logistics and tech to make this event possible. Gabby Choi, the administrator for comparative literature, was key to setting up the online event. I thank Professor Karen Underhill of the University of Illinois, Chicago, and the Chicago YIVO Society for co-sponsorship of today's event. And I want to thank all the applicants as well. We received more than 40 proposals when we put out the call for papers on the theme of Yiddish ecologies. And in fact, we received so many proposals focused on Sutzkever's work that we decided to do a separate individual event solely on Sutzkever and ecology, which is today's gathering. I hope we will remain in touch as we explore what Yiddish ecologies might mean. And for a bit of framing about the two parts of the conference, Yiddish Ecologies, most often the keyword associated with Yiddish studies is diaspora. This conference is about exploring what happens when that keyword shifts from diaspora to ecology. How might recentering Yiddish studies, even just for a couple of days, put us in conversation with other fields and attend to that word itself, field, as a space of botanical possibility? What emerges when we think less in the abstract realm of diaspora, a term that has offered so much theoretical richness, so much communion with other disciplines, but more in the material, biological, animal, and botanical realms of ecology? Can we speak of ecological language, not just of loanwords, but of shared linguistic landscapes? Is ecological language more than a metaphor? How might we think of ecological time in relation to poetry, the reinvention of language again and again by those who speak it and learn it? How does the credo of Doakite, of here-ness, relate, for example, to ecological thought, which emerges in other languages as well? I'm curious to see what definitions of ecology will emerge over the next few hours in relation to Sutzkever, a poet whose life had such a variety of environmental encounters. And while Sutzkever as a poet may need no introduction, I will give a little bit of context. Sutzkever's ecological poetics emerged from heterogeneously secular and religious sources. His worldview was inspired in part by both Spinozist pantheism, as Harshav argues, and by the secular Yiddish movements, including the Scouting movement of interwar Vilna. His experiences of ecological encounter ranged from the landscapes of the steppe in his early years in Omsk, Siberia, to his years as a partisan, hidden and fighting in Lithuanian forests, to his arrival in Mandate, Palestine in 1947, and later to his travels in South Africa. Sutzkever, who lived from 1913 to 2010, was born in Smorgon, now in Belarus, home of the infamous Bear Academy, which trained bears to perform in circuses and traveling shows. So there's an early connection with animality. During his early childhood, Sutzkever fled with his family to the southwestern Siberian city of Omsk on the Irtysh River. After the sudden passing of his father, Herz, a fiddler, his mother, Irena, brought the family to Vilna, where he studied literature in Polish, Russian, and Hebrew. In 1933, Sutzkever joined the Young Vilna group of Yiddish poets and artists. Prominent among Vilna's cultural leaders was Max Weinreich, director of the Educational Institute and Archive YIVO, and the head of BIN, the Yiddish Scouting Organization, which recruited Sutzkever. BIN cultivated Scouts' relationship to the Lithuanian countryside through camping and other direct experiences with the land. Initiation into being involved swearing an oath of service to Yiddish culture, merging devotion to language and to landscape. A. Golem, a writer and nature teacher associated with Bean, declared that, quote, all the birds spoke Yiddish. In the first part of the conference, Cecile Kuznets and other scholars showed the significance of the Yiddish cultural movement for staging environmental encounters with spaces in and around Vilna, including YIVO's own architecture and landscaping. Today, we will hear about Sutzkever's relation to geographies of Siberia, South Africa, mythical and surreal spatialities, and more. The plan for today is to hear from 5 panelists. We will have a break after the first 3 papers, and during that break, Christa Whitney, the documentary director and oral historian at the Yiddish Book Center, will screen a 10-minute excerpt from the film Wer wird bleiben, Who Will Remain. And now I'll turn it to Christa to tell us a little about the speakers.
So I'm excited to and really honored to be asked to moderate the panel today. I'll be jumping in just to give intros, and then I'll see you all at the end for the discussion. So if you have questions as you go along, feel free to put them in the chat, I think is the way that works for this kind of a Zoom meeting, and then I will collate them and feed them to the panelists at the end. So we're going to start out today with Eva Hückmann. So I will read the bio. So Eva Hückmann received her BA in philosophy and Russian studies at the Johannes Gutenberg University Mainz, and her MA in Eastern European Cultural Studies at the University of Potsdam. Her areas of study include gender studies, Russophone women's literature from the 21st until the 19th century, Yiddish literature, and literature of forced migration. Since 2023, Eva works as lecturer at the chair for Slavic Literatures and Cultures at the University of Potsdam. Eva is also active as a political educator and educates on topics such as anti-Semitism, conspiracy thinking, and democracy. In her PhD project, she examines the poetics of forced migration into the Soviet Union during the World War II via English, Yiddish, Russian, and Polish autobiographical literature.
In my talk, and I invite you to read Avrom Sutzkever's Sibir with me from an eco-criticist perspective. I explore the revised edition of the long poem, which was published in Jerusalem in 1953, since I currently don't have access to the first version, which was published in 1937. And I'm working with the most current translation of Sibir from Richard Fien from 2019. In my talk, I will at times... can you see the next slide? Yeah, okay. In my talk, I will at times recur to Anna Elena concepts such as entanglement, assemblage, and attunement. She developed these concepts in her book From the Mushroom to the End of the World, Life in Capitalist Ruins, to describe the possibility of survival for living beings in post-capitalist landscapes. Her concepts help me elucidate Sutzkever's creation of Siberia as a space of memory where the world enlivens. The space in the poem Sibir comes alive. Tones erupt, human and non-human beings watch, cheekily gesture, and communicate with each other. The beings are not just connected by way of communication, however. Sutzkever's poetic language produces a sensory entanglement of the living beings in that landscape. The sensory entanglement is the precondition for the spiritual survival of the human poetic personas in Sibir. So from my description, we gather that Sutzkever's Siberia comes to life. But what is the long poem about? Sibir tells the story of a Kind von 7 Jahren who lives in a Siberian village near the Irtysh. In the poem, Sutzkever molds his childhood memories of Siberia into a poetic form. The poem consists of 24 stanzas, each containing 12 lines written in Trochaic pentameter. There are 15 chapters, some of which stretch over 2 or 3 stanzas. The poem begins with a young boy's journey in the chapter In the Village in snowy winter. It continues with Siberia in spring and summer and concludes with a chapter called North Star. The setting and the themes the long poem reflect on, such as the death of the father and the limitations of memory, are deeply connected to Sutzkever's life and poetic oeuvre. To touch on the biographical elements, Sutzkever himself lived in Omsk with his family when he was 2 to 7 years old, after the family had fled the front of the Great War in Smargon. And Sutzkever's father perished during this time, so that his mother decided to return to Vilna with her 3 children in 1920. These elements become themes which the poem confronts. Sutzkever wrote the first version of the long poem titled Stern in Schnee in 1936, when he was 23. And as Sonny Jutke found, Sutzkever chose the title Stern in Schnee after Itzik Manger proposed it to him. With Manger's help, Sutzkever was able to publish Stern in Schnee in 1937 in the volume Lieder. And Sutzkever reworked the poem after the war and published it a second time as Sibir in 1953 in Jerusalem. This time on its own and adorned with visual interpretations created by his friend Marc Chagall, whose works of art you've already seen on the slides. So after having shared some basic information about the long poem and its contents and speaking about my reading of it, let us explore what I described as an assemblage by delving into the poem. To reiterate, I understand assemblage as a landscape with intertwined but autonomous, attuned beings, following Anna Zing. Let's examine the reciprocal attunement between human and natural spheres in the very first stanza. The scene begins from a bird's eye view. The sun is going down on icy blue paths. The dusk is promptly mirrored in the human's experience, süße Drömmefarben in Gemüt. Blazing colors of the sunset enter someone's drowsy mind. After the calm of night, the landscape awakens. Doves coo and by cooing create the poetic persona's face. The river Irtish is moving lazily under the ice, and a 7-year-old child is blossoming. Such entangled mirroring is continuously present within the long poem. Not all beings are always positively in tune to one another, however, they are always intertwined. This entanglement is often explicated by an overlap of senses. Take, for example, the third stanza. The father plays the violin. Still, das spielt der Tate. Und die Klangen durch en eisig angepelzten Scheibe schmeckt der Wolf zum Fleisch von der Musik. Here, the world of the father with his music collides with the world of the wolf and his next meal. Through synesthesia, the smelling wolf is connected to the violin-playing and sound-producing father. As we've seen here, through the sensory entanglement, the world which Sutzkever creates in his poem is akin to utopian. Yet, the blossoming child of 7 years is not just coddled by this world. He experiences his first existential falls. In the second chapter of Der Kenntnis, after he had asked his father where the world ends and had received the answer that it ends behind a hut on a mountaintop, the boy finds out that his father was wrong, because he goes on that mountaintop. At that place, the world did not end, but continued. Und kein Sof, ni do, ni do, ni do. This recognition transforms the boy. He is no longer a child, but an avalanche. His father is absent during this revelatory moment. Another hardship the poetic persona encounters is the death of his father. The chapter Zum Taten begins with a child accompanying his father in a coffin. While at the graveside, the boy holds a white dove near his chest. When he sees the abyss engulf his father, he has a desire to follow him into it. But in just that moment, the dove flies to the sky, bringing the young boy with it zum Leben. Sutzkever's prose poem, Ode zu der Treub from 1954, the image of the dove can be interpreted as a metaphor for triumph over silence, as Ruth Wisse notes. In Ode zu der Treub, a boy saves a dove, and in return, the boy asks for his help when he calls it, whether there be rain, snow, or fire. When he calls the dove, it is to unlock his lips. The dove unlocks them and enables him to utter sounds. In Sibir, a dove also comes to save the boy when he is in great need. My exploration of these parts of the poem have shown that the mythical landscape of Siberia and Sibir is an assemblage in which the boy is confronted with life-altering moments. But there are beings in the stanza Zum Tatten, envisioned as a dove, that save the boy when he is teetering on the brink of an abyss. Even though the dove acts as a metaphor here, we will see in the stanzas about the Schneemensch that sound and other senses ties the poetic persona to nature and is an emblem of life. Before I continue with the analysis of snowmen, I want to differentiate the narrative voices present in the long poem. On the one hand, there's the auctorial voice that describes the boy's adventures and perceptions, and also has access to other beings' inner worlds. On the other hand, the voice of a reminiscing adult narrates, reflecting on his life and his former self as a child of 7 years, and who in Zapfanstern, the last chapter, reveals himself as being a poet. For the reminiscing adult, the place of Siberia is tied to the figure of the snowman. The Schneemensch is the Denkmalnache Kindheit, a monument of childhood. The chronotopian figure of the snowman is the reminiscing narrator's guardian. He represents the wholeness, innocence, and playfulness of uncorrupted youth. Furthermore, he is described here as being immortal, ewig, and a god von Wind, meaning even the elements cannot harm him. What I wish to highlight here is that the snowman is not just the narrator's guardian, he's also the protector of other beings, as the chorus Hit behit of the wolves show. Even the wolves, who are usually depicted as hunters, seek the protection of the snowman. I believe that these wolves should not be thought of as metaphors. In these lines, human beings and animals are depicted as being in kinship over yearning for everlasting wholeness. Sutzkever's celebration of Siberia as a space of wholeness and indestructible joy is surprising insofar as the Sutzkever family fled to Omsk from war. Furthermore, when considering Eastern European literary traditions, Sutzkever's Siberia is in stark juxtaposition to a prevalent tradition of depicting Siberia as a metonymic space of exile, suffering, and exploitations. And on the slide, you can see some examples of this tradition. But when we return to the snowman in the second chapter, we find that a darker thought replaces the celebration of playfulness and innocence of the first stanza. This switch begins with the narrator's ominous hypothetical. Ob mein Bänkschaft ist zu dir dergangen, in dieselbe tritt Simonem gay. If my longing finally reaches you, go in those very marks left by my feet. The narrator can only yearn for the snowman, not reach him. If he has given in to his yearning for wholeness and has succeeded in reaching him, he is no longer alive. The reminiscing narrator calls on the snowman to take his place. When stepping in his footsteps, the snowman should find him in a Stiebele von Klangen, praying to snow. Richard Fien translates the Stiebele von Klangen as a shul of sound, thus underlying the pantheistic image of praying to snow. Simultaneously, Fien's rendition links Siberia to later spaces which the poetic persona inhabited, like, for example, a Vilna shul. The original Stiebele von Klangen is more abstract and harks back to 2 earlier lines in the poem. Jeder Schnee is a verfroren Gleckel, gib berühr und es entwirrt mit der Klung, which highlights the aliveness of snow. Furthermore, in the chapter In de Schlitten in verbänkte Klängen, life is likened to a chiming sleigh ride in the snow. Sound is a vehicle of life, and by praying to snow, the snowman chapter is liking praying to nature, to having faith and praying to God. The stanza ends with the narrator's request towards the snowman to perform a miracle. Besto jerschen mein Gewesenkeit von Stiebel und verendig Ortemen mein Zeit. He asks the snowman to carry on living his life in the Stiebele until it comes to its rightful end. In the second snowman chapter, it becomes apparent what power the Siberian chronotopos holds for the reminiscing persona. Furthermore, the powerful snowman with his dual nature can be accessed through his materiality by way of touch and sound. While the stanza ends with the impossible request for living another's unlived life, there is the other instance in the long poem where the saving of a poetic persona is actually achieved. The last stanza of the poem Sibir makes clear that the reminiscing narrator is a poet, and that he, by writing, turns into an everlasting snowman himself. The sounds, die Klangen he produces, as Yudkov writes, hover like a monument over him, with the North Star being a metaphor for his poetry. In Siberia, not only a child blossomed, but a poet. This moment is also referenced in poems of Grüner Aquarium. And even if the poetic persona's life should end, his Klangen will remain. I want to conclude by reiterating that in Sibir, Sutzkever creates a world that is like an assemblage. It seems that the sensory entanglement is what connects the poetic persona to the beings, to the world, and to life. Thank you.
So next we have Dr. Karolina Koprowska, assistant professor at the Institute of Jewish Studies at the Jagiellonian University. She is the author of books written in Polish. Since I don't speak Polish, I'm not going to try to read the original titles, but the first is called Bystanders, ? The Holocaust in the Accounts of Peasant Witnesses. That was published in Krakow in 2018. And the second, Birthplace as Entanglement, Identity Projects in Polish and Yiddish Literature, Warszawa 2024. She was a research fellow at the Institute for the History of Polish Jewry and the Israel-Poland Relations at the Tel Aviv University in 2023 to 2024. She has received several prestigious awards and scholarships, including the FNP START Scholarship in 2021 and the Ministry of Science and Higher Education Scholarship in 2019.
Avrom Sutzkever is undoubtedly one of the Jewish Yiddish writers who explore nature as a central theme, examining its role, power, and influence on the human condition. What makes his approach to nature unique is his intertwining of natural imagery with autothematic investigations. Scholars analyzing his poetry, such as Heder Valencia, Joanna Lisek-Degler, and Avraham Noverstern, emphasize that Sutzkever treats nature as a primary source of literary inspiration and exploration. In my analysis, I aim to shift the focus from nature as a static metapoetic metaphor to landscape as an active participant in the experience of the migrating subject. This takes the form of what I call a displaced landscape, one that is detached from a geographically and topographically defined place, and as a result moves alongside the migrant, existing in their imagination and memory, while simultaneously accompanying their struggles with identity. In her discussion of diaspora movements, anthropologist Barbara Bender indicates that, and I'm quoting, "This location is also relocation. People are always in some relationship to the landscape they move through. They are never nowhere." She argues that migrants are able to interact with and internalize different landscapes, making each one an integral part of the movement experience and using them to navigate between past and present, between familiarity and unfamiliarity, or between home and displacement. This process influences the status of landscape, which can be compared to palimpsest, and now I see a nice moment of dialogue with Eva presentation and the concept of assemblage introduced by her. I'm attempting to use in my analysis a concept of palimpsest, which in landscape studies refers to the multi-layered status of landscape, both symbolic and physical. It describes the natural and cultural processes that accumulate in various overlapping layers, manifesting as material and immaterial traces that can be uncovered and interpreted. The palimpsest metaphor implies that different layers of the landscape, including those that are not entirely visible, form a continuum. Only when considered as a whole do they reveal the true and complete story of a place. When analyzing the status of the landscape in the context of displacement, it is crucial to focus not only on its ontology as a multi-layered palimpsest, but also on the relationship between his layers, how, if at all, they intersect or interact. For the migrating subject, struggling with questions of identity, the displaced landscape triggers the process of settling into a new place, different from their birthplace. This new world feels undernourished because it lacks the memory and experience that shape one's sense of belonging. However, this does not exclude the possibility of domesticating the unfamiliar landscape. Barbara Bender notes that, and I'm quoting, as experience deepens, reconciliation becomes possible, although always the present sense of being at home is predicated on an earlier and different sense of place and belonging. This process involves mediating between two types of landscapes, one familiar and the other unfamiliar. The familiar landscape serves as a source of rootedness, linked to the concept of home, family, and childhood. The unfamiliar landscape, shaped by a different topography, environment, socio-cultural structure, and language, evokes a sense of strangeness. In Sutzkever's poetry, written after his aliyah to Israel and reflecting on this experience, the landscape consists of three main layers: Israeli intertwined with biblical, Tanakhic, and Eastern European images. Each of these layers corresponds to a specific sensual and material topography, while also carrying cultural meanings, personal emotions, and aesthetic associations. Within this juxtaposition of landscapes, Sutzkever brings up a central paradox, one well known in both Yiddish and Hebrew literature, regarding the condition of diaspora Jews settling in Eretz Israel. The Israeli landscape appears foreign and unfamiliar compared to the Eastern European one in which they were born and raised, yet at the same time it feels deeply connected, preserved in Jewish tradition and history as a mythologized image of the lost and then restored homeland. Sutzkever's early volumes in Feuerwogen from 1952 and in Midbar Sinai from 1957 capture the Israeli landscape from the perspective of a poetic subject, wandering through various places, including Jerusalem, Tzfat, kibbutzim in northern Israel, Tiberias, and the Negev desert. As both a wanderer and a new immigrant, he perceives the Israeli landscape as an integral part of Jewish culture and tradition. Consequently, he describes his experience of Aliyah through biblical and religious associations. In one poem, he admits to himself that he has arrived naked, bist gekommen an der Kette, while in another, he hears primeval sounds, breisches dike Klangen, thereby evoking the primordial imagery of Eden. To him, Israel becomes a land where every pebble is my grandfather, wo jeder Steindl is mein Seide. In the poem Aleph, published in the volume in Midbar Sinai, he addresses the desert, saying, "The yearning tear on my eyelash is as old as you. From that desert generation it comes. Die Trer die Benkendike auf mein Wie ist alt wie du. Von dort Hamidber stammt sie." Reinforcing his cultural ties with the ancient Jewish heritage and collective identity, the subject discovers his own sense of belonging to the Israeli landscape and seeks to establish his identity in the land of his ancestors. The dynamic between the Israeli and Eastern European landscapes is metaphorically articulated as a contrast between snow and fire. While these metaphors evoke different associations, they serve a common function, merging past and present, connecting the subject's lived reality with the one preserved in memory. The images associated with fire, on the one hand, refer to current living conditions in Israel, considering both its geographical position with a Mediterranean climate and its political situation. In one of the poems from the cycle Wo Stillkeit rangelt sich mit Schweigen, in the volume In Firewogen, the poetic subject declares, "To the drops falling on the blazed up ground, I throw myself thirsty, closer, closer, closer." And in Yiddish, "Zu die fallen dicke Tropens auf der Erd zerbrennt bin ich zugefallen durstig, nennt nennt nennt." Similarly, the poem Der Boim in Ein Josef depicts the ground as so inflamed and searing that the sound begins to resemble burning blades of grass. "Es flackert das Sand wie gezundene Sangen." In the poem written in 1947, the land of Israel is described as the volcanic soil during childbirth, vulkanisch Land in Hevle Leide, symbolizing the tumultuous process of the fledgling Jewish state's emergence. Fire also appears in the biblical references, such as the burning bush, like in the following poem, "Leben Sinai halbe Nacht, wo Stillkeit rangelt sich mit Schweigen, flammt a Dorn, schot a Blitz, herumgezunden in die Zweigen." The fire metaphors also allude to the story of Elijah, who was taken to heaven in a chariot of fire, as seen in the poem Azeuung. These few examples demonstrate, as I mentioned earlier, the way the subject perceives the Israeli landscape through cultural and symbolic images. On the other hand, fire, as part of Holocaust imagery, signifies both the destruction of Eastern European Jewry and the personal traumatic experience the subject carries with him to the new land. In the poem Die Beiner von Yosef, he considers the possibility of repeating the biblical testament of Joseph in relation to those murdered in the Holocaust, meaning the symbolic reburial of their bones in the land of Israel. In the third stanza, the parallel he draws highlights the disconnect between Israeli, biblical, and Eastern European heritages. The bones of Joseph here under sun, the bones of Joseph there under Poland, they don't know each other, act like strangers, and cut like knives and glow like coals. Die Beiner von Josefen da unter Semder, die Beiner von Josefen dort unter Polen, der kennen sich winzig und bleiben als Fremder und schneiden wie Messers und glühen wie Keulen. Rhymes typical of Sutzkever's poetry carry meaning. Zemder rhymes here with Fremder, evoking strangeness of Israeli landscape, while Polen rhymes with Keulen, referring to the destruction of the Eastern European diaspora. In Sutzkever's poetry, fire is not only a destructive force, but introduces also the flame of past heritage, everything that continues to burn despite attempts to extinguish it. This includes the memory of the Holocaust and the culture of the Jewish diaspora preserved through the Yiddish language. The most striking example of fire as a symbol of continued existence can be found in the poem Gleklich von Kemlen, Bells of Camels, where the subject declares, "I will with my windy lips fan a glowing coal of the Yiddish word. Ich will mit windige Lippen zerblasen, gleiche Keul von dem Yiddischen Wort." The metaphor of snow reveals multiple meanings. similarly to the metaphor of fire. But this metaphor of snow is most powerfully expressed and depicted in the poem Der Schnee auf den Hermon, The Snow on Mount Hermon, written in 1948. Here, snow serves as a link between Eastern European and Israeli landscapes, intertwining with different layers of memory. It evokes snowy Siberia, a semi-mythological land that recalls the poet's happy childhood memories, an image of the first home as a safe place, and his first aesthetic experience when he discovered the beauty of the landscape. A similar meaning of snow as a reference to remembered Siberia is conveyed in the poem Tverje, Tiberias, written in 1949. It depicts a mirage-like landscape where a snowy mystery play, die Schneeige Mysterie, blends with a rainbow Regenbogen above Mount Hermon. The subject also says, and you see this first stanza of this poem on the screen, on one side, a rainbow rises like a giant palm tree. Opposite at exactly the same height, Mount Hermon, as if a piece of Siberia had lost its way here. Von een Seite wie a Riesenpalme hebt a Regenbogen sich, und gegen Punkt dieselbe Heich der Hermon, wie du wollt a Stück Sibir verblonget. Snow, however, also evokes memories, as expressed in the poem already mentioned, Der Schnee auf den Hermon. Memories of the Jews, and I'm quoting from this poem, of the Jews who, like pure flakes of snow, silently fell all winter long. Die Jiden, was wie Schnee en Chlore, sennen sie gefallen Stummerheit a ganzen Winter. This imagery alludes to the Hurden and to the murder of Vilnius Jews in the Ponar forest, suggesting that for the poem's subject, snow becomes also a symbol of the Holocaust, death, and trauma. It also triggers his memory of those who were murdered, compelling him to integrate their legacy into the collective heritage. For this reason, in the final stanza of the poem Der Schnee auf den Hermon, he asks the bird from Mount Hermon to bring on its wings the children's snow from the old home. He concludes that without that snow, it will be cold in this hot, fiery land. Onem Schnee wird kalt sein in der flammiger Medine. The interplay of snow and fire, heat and cold, expressed in this metaphor, indicates that without a connection to the diasporic heritage, he cannot fully belong to Israel. Seeing himself as a representative of Jewish immigrants to Israel, he speaks here not only about his individual belonging to the new old home, but also about the collective experience of building the new old homeland. In his early Israeli poetry, Sutzkever, as we can conclude this first part of my and the main part of my presentation, Sutzkever combines a mystical and cultural sense of belonging to the Israeli land with the conviction that only by acknowledging the Jewish past in the diaspora, which still lived with him, and integrating it with the new reality, would it be possible to establish a new identity in the old new country, in both an individual and collective sense. The displaced landscape allows him to create a poetic palimpsest that conveys an idea of cultural merging the Eastern European landscape with the Israeli one, which is determined by two key reasons. Firstly, it plays a role in reconceptualizing the author's identity as both a Holocaust survivor and an immigrant to Eretz Israel. In this sense, the displaced landscape helps him overcome the feeling of not fully belonging in the old new landscape. Secondly, it serves as the foundation for Sutzkever's vision of a new Israeli culture and identity, one rooted in the heritage of Eastern European Jews and Yiddish language. In this way, the displaced landscape also acquires a political and ideological dimension, as Sutzkever's idea stands in opposition to the contemporary cultural politics of the newly established state, which was founded on the ideology of the negation of exile. Sutzkever's later poetry develops two closely intertwined artistic tasks. First, it continues, as Mordechai Litvin put it, to search for the ultimate metaphor for his own creation, for the very essence of the poet's being. This poetic self-inquiry is related to a second complementary task, which is to integrate of the dead into the world of the living through the transformative power of poetic word. The goal is not to reenact the Holocaust by obsessively returning to the moment of loss, thus becoming trapped in an endless loop of past and trauma, but rather, as Sol Noam Zarit observes, to constantly reconsider the loss, paradoxically as an opportunity for regeneration, a call to the ways in which the dead constitute the living without overburdening the present. How does the concept of displaced landscape evolve in Sutzkever's later poetry? To address this question, I will closely but briefly, because probably I don't have much time already, I will briefly analyze a poem from 1981 included in his cycle Lieder von Togbuch. This poem echoes the symbolic gesture found in the earlier pieces, Der Schneeaffen Hermann and Ferie, by bringing a diasporic and past landscape into the present reality inhabited by the poetic subject. In the poem, he writes about receiving a small blade of grass from Ponar enclosed in a letter from his hometown. This image of a Gräsel von Ponar, serving as a memory cue, sparks, as the poem describes, the faces of the letters, letter after letter. Hot ongezunden os noch os, die Pennemer von Oisies. In Sutzkever's imagery, grass is a recurrent metapoetic symbol. Like other nature images, it expresses the belief in permanence and renewal. A Gräsel von Ponar becomes also a life force, reviving the dead and ultimately transforming into mein Welt, mein heimisch Miniature, mein miniature world of home. The displaced landscape no longer aims to mediate between Eastern European and Israeli landscapes by externally projecting their integration. Instead, it creates an intimate and metaphysical space, mein Welt, mein heimisch Miniature, which is undefined and exists beyond the physical realm, yet is deeply intertwined with the subject's internal world. It invites ghosts to participate in the artistic act, thereby offering him a sense of being at home. In the final stanza, the speaker declares that with his miniature of the extinguished Jewish world, he will find his place in the yearned for kindly earth. No more I will be parted from this grass of my hometown. My yearn for kindly earth shall make for both of us a place. And then I bring to the Lord a present from afar, the little blade of grass from Ponar. And in Yiddish, ich will sich mit den Gräsel von der Heimstatt nicht zerscheiden. Mein ausgebänkte gute Erd wird machen Ort verbeiden. Und jemals will ich bringen Amatone fahren Haar, das Gräsel von Ponar. This vague image raises question. Does the description of mein ausgebänkte gute Erd refer to Israel as a homeland where the subject, despite living there, still has not found his place because as we can assume, Eastern European diaspora heritage is still not fully welcomed in Israel? Or does it refer to Vilna, his hometown in Lithuania, to which he longs to return even symbolically? The poetic subject also states that he will bring to the Lord a matone, which is dos Gräsel von Ponar. The use of the word matone, a present, gift, may allude to Yitzhak Leibush Peretz's story Drei Matones, 3 gifts. I would like just briefly remind that Peretz's story tells of a wandering soul sent to collect good deeds from around the Jewish world. While the story initially appears to praise pious deeds, it eventually questions the merit of excessive self-destructive piety. Given the irony is a key literary strategy in Peretz's work, it could also be implied in the conclusion of Sutzkever's poem. In light of this, is it possible that the act of bringing those Grezel von Poner to the Lord conveys a theodical accusation, or returning to the concept of the displaced landscape, does this image express disappointment and ironic observation that his, and I mean Sutzkever's, efforts to continue the Yiddish legacy, which has not been fully acknowledged in the new old homeland, are ultimately meaningless? This would then suggest that his mission to transmit Eastern European landscape and heritage to Israel proves in the end impossible. Okay, thank you very much.
So next we have Rachel Martin, a PhD candidate at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, who focuses on 20th century multilingual poets. She has lived on 3 continents and frequently returns to topics of memory, nationhood, and cross-cultural communication. She has 2 master's degrees, works as an instructional designer, and previously taught in a bilingual school. She is also an adjunct instructor for English and Communication Studies at Carroll College.
All right, so I will be sharing with you my paper, Remixing Place, Translating Ecologies and the Imprint of Africa in Avrom Sutzkever's Poetic Landscape. So Avrom Sutzkever's 42 Africa poems, published as a cycle as the middle section of his 1955 collection, Ode to a Dove, were inspired by 3 months that he spent in South Africa and surrounding areas between September and December 1950. Sutzkever had traveled to South Africa to connect with Jewish communities there. His trip had originally been planned to last 3 weeks, but the enthusiastic reception that he received led him to extend it by more than 2 additional months. This gave him time to explore, steeping himself in both nature and culture. Among the long list of places he visited, Sutzkever saw the Kruger National Park, Lake Victoria, and the Kalahari Desert. Now, these locations were not immediately obvious to me when I first encountered Sutzkever's Africa poems, and this is important to the journey I'm going to take you through today. I met these poems while working with folios by the artist Ed Kolker in the special collections at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, where I am a doctoral candidate. Ed Kolker is an artist, a printmaker, and an educator who owns his own publication house at Hayburn Press. They do small print runs of art and text together. Kolker is a native Yiddish speaker who was born in 1927 in Philadelphia, and he published a limited edition illustrated folio with 18 of Sutzkever's Africa poems in 2005 under the title From Elephants by Night, Poems of Africa. He published a second folio in honor of Sutzkever after his death, which was titled Poems from Africa 2. Together, the 2 collections contain 27 of the 42 Africa poems, with 4 poems present in both collections. But let's jump back. I didn't know any of this when I started. So this slide here just shows my first introduction to any of Sutzkever's Africa poems. I'd read a lot of his other works, but not these. I was looking at other folios by Kolker, as I mentioned, and I came across this one. My immediate thought was, what do you mean by Africa? Or if I was preparing the question for a real answer, I would have said, where do you mean in Africa? So as you kind of heard in my bio, I've lived a couple places. I lived and taught in Dakar, Senegal for a school year. So I get a little defensive about overgeneralizations. So it's fair to say that from the beginning, I was looking for geographic references. Now, I'm going to read you the titles of the poems by Sutzkever that Kolker included in this second Poems from Africa 2 collection. And I want you to think for a moment if there are any indications of where they're taking place. Now, not every poem in this folio is illustrated. I am going to show you images from 3 pages of them. If you want to see more of them, you can find 5 additional images online through the University of Michigan's digital collection. I'm going to show you just these 3 pages, wanting to balance giving you an idea of the visual presentation on the page, and also being very mindful of the fact that this presentation is being recorded and I believe will be posted online. So of course I want to be very respectful of the rights of the author. It's also really important to note that these translations into English are done by Mel Connor, and we're going to be talking a lot about his translations as we move forward. So here's the titles of the poems. Elephants by Night, A Meteor in the Kalahari Desert, Zunga, I Dance, The Dream. There's the page with the art for The Dream. The Ladder, Love Song, Dirge of a Young Widow, Rain Dance, Oasis, The Black King, Diamond Girl, Remembering 3 Flamingos. Now, these are odd poems in a way, especially when you consider them with the question, how African inspired are they? Are they poems that tell us something about being in Africa, about Africa itself? Are they poems that could only have taken place in Africa? Or was Sutzkever using a perhaps charged or heightened backdrop for other explorations? Well, let's take a little bit of a close reading of the one I have here on screen, Dirge of a Young Widow. We have, as we look through it, I want you to look for words or phrases that indicate a place. We have no use for stars. We have a reference to a sad earth, a sun in the sea. These are all very earthy, very landscape, but they're not specific. We have a reference to eating corn, a storm-red ox. We finally have a lion, and then back to stars. The only image in this poem that is uniquely African is the lion. And I don't actually want to over-exaggerate that because Sutzkever had used lions in his poems before, and he would continue to use them as a symbol later. So let me give you just some examples of when he had used lions as imagery in poems. This is from Siberia. We have Young Lion Roars. I've added the highlight, or I've added the bold there. I'm posting Richard Fine's translation from The Full Pomegranate. In the poem Yiddish, which was published the same year that he went to Africa, but written before, he references like a lion again. So these are not images that I read and say, obviously he was standing in Africa. This is very African coded as he wrote it. And this one comes from Like Sun Through a Crevice, which was written, was it 1989? So that one comes much later. Yet animals are really important to this cycle of poems. I don't want to minimize that. Sutzkever, in these poems, he described animals big and small, and elephants have a special significance. They come up a lot. He just didn't really tell us where he was standing, or perhaps it wasn't important where he was standing at the time he encountered them. So with the exception of the poem I put back on screen here, which is The Meteor in the Kalahari Desert, and a poem that we're going to talk about in a few minutes that includes a reference to the Nile, many of the locations are vague or full of multiple possibilities. So close readings could only take me so far. Being very much nature poetry, full of invocations of animals and infused with references to mythological figures and to folklore that he was learning as he went out and encountered people in different settings. It's also worth noting that Sutzkever's African poems also contain erotic poems, which is not something we typically associate. It's not something he's typically known for. So taken all together, Sutzkever's African poems operate in a sort of ambiguous space between being geographic references and poetic placeholders. Yet they're pretty captivating, especially in this form with these non-illustrative or only slightly representative, non-representative pieces of art and accompanying them. But to dig into these more, I felt I needed to historicize. I really did want to know where was Sutzkever, what was he doing with the landscape, with the ecologies he was encountering. And I, through this process, was asking myself if I was even going to like the answers when I found them. So to complicate this tension between geographic reference and poetic placeholders is, of course, the process of anthologizing. So as I mentioned, 27 of Sutzkever's Africa poems appear across 2 different portfolios by Ed Kolker. This is how I met them initially, but I think most people probably have met, if they have met, Sutzkever's African poems, have met them through Barbara and Benjamin Harshov's Selected Poetry and Prose from 1991. That's kind of the authoritative collection. But I did even manage to find, there's 22 of the Africa poems in there, and it's not a subset of the ones that Kolker illustrated or chose to publish. I even managed to find 3 of them tucked into the 1961 version of The Golden Peacock. So the rest of this paper reports on my engagement with the questions of what happens when a poet transforms real landscapes into symbolic or abstracted poetic spaces, and then what happens when we receive them again through more layers of the anthologizing process. Specifically, I'm asking what can we understand, or what are ways we can understand Sutzkever's writings about Africa, given the way that the poems have been grouped and transmitted into English. Posed another way, I might ask if for Sutzkever, Africa was place or placeholder. My understanding of the concept of place is drawn from Yifeng Tong's, who defines place as space made meaningful through experience. Within this definition, a location is not inherently significant until it's endued with personal or cultural value. And we do know this was a significant trip for Sutzkever. He was having these amazing community moments, bringing together groups that usually didn't collaborate together. He extended his stay because it was a meaningful personal experience for him. So that kind of supports the idea of it being a place. As we heard in the introduction, and most of us would probably agree, Yiddish poetics is usually dominated by discussions around poetics of displacement and diaspora, but focusing on South Africa as a space where Sutzkever had meaningful personal experiences when he wrote from this overflow of wonder, really kind of shifts the conversation to one of environment, place, and maybe even imprint. My contrasting term here, placeholders, I'm really drawing out of semiotics literature here. They're a concept that can either fix a meaning, they can defer a meaning or hold it temporarily. Because a symbol, in contrast, relies on convention to resemble or signify something else. And I'm using Charles Peirce here. While a placeholder, in contrast, is not a symbol in the same way because it's standing in for a meaning that's not yet known or fully formed. So I find myself asking, were the complex human-animal ecologies that Sutzkever encountered in South Africa provisional vessels of wonder in which he could project his own metamorphosis as a poet? Do we better understand them as places or placeholders? One more framing concept I want to add into this discussion is the concept of poetic space. Baccalaureate held that the spaces we encounter in poetry, they're typically less geographic, more effective, and they're internalized through memory, desire, and reverie. And I think we can see all 3 of those qualities in what Sutzkever produced in this time. So taken together, these concepts caution us against a single reductive reading. In his own framing afterwards of these poems, in an afterword to these poems, Sutzkever scholar Justin Cami writes that, quote, "These poems are best experienced as an invitation into a mythical world." And Cami, it's worth noting, is drawing on Sutzkever's own description there when he's choosing the phrase mythical world. And I think that's really, really important because Sutzkever was a master of the mythopoetic biography. Throughout the different phases of his life, he associated himself with powerful, sweeping landscapes. They were real places, but they became more than places when he wrote about them. So I began this talk kind of by situating these poems in their historic origins. And as I said, I didn't know any of that when I started. By happenstance, by luck, by great timing, in October 2024, Mel Connor, the same person who translated, he's an anthropologist, he translated, it was his translation that Kolker was using in the folios. He published what is, at least for right now, the authoritative bilingual book containing all 42 of Sutzkever's Africa poems. Connor states that he began working on these translations, the translations of this group of poems about 40 years ago. And he's had a lot of time to sit with them and to work with them in different contexts. This new book, Elephants by Night, contains an excellent afterword by Justin Cami, which I just quoted from, and which I drew on for the historical context of this talk. Now, one thing both Cami and Connor anticipate and try to provide a way to avoid in their framing of Sutzkever's Africa poems are the pitfalls of a contemporary reading that would dismiss Sutzkever for indulging in a sort of Africa as exotic trope or practicing cultural appropriation or perpetuating stereotypes. He was only there 3 months. However, Cami directly writes, and I quote, "I encourage readers to engage with Sutzkever's text from its own Jewish and Yiddish histories of marginalization, displacement, and trauma at the hands of Europe, rather than as an extension of European fantasies on Africa." So with my remaining time, I want to lean further into this discussion of fantasy, what is fantasy, what is mythological, and what Africa actually was in this experience for Sutzkever. As with all poetry cycles, there's variety within the corpus of it. What we think Sutzkever is talking about when he talks about Africa is as much dependent on which poems from the cycle one chooses to read. I mean, that's a truism, but it kind of underlines where I'm going with this. So I took the 42 poems here and I looked at where they've been anthologized. And although I would like to expand on this even more comprehensively, and this is something that I'm looking for in the Q&A, if anyone wants to suggest other anthologies where they know some of Sutzkever's African poems have been included. For today, I'm really looking at 3 different locations. So the folios that I mentioned, the Harshov's book, and then the 3 that were in Left, which is 1961 anthology. So 27 of them, 22 and 3 of them appear there. Here's how the poems are distributed by frequency. As you can see, there are 3 poems that appear in all of these locations. And there are 8 poems that didn't make it in any of the anthologies, but of course now we have them in the new book. So the 3 poems that appeared in each location are All Rushing, All Sound, At the Nile, and Elephants by Night. And I'm going to term these the kind of the quintessential Africa poems that we all for Sutzkever. If someone knows about the poems that Sutzkever wrote about Africa, it seems likely that they know about the collection through one of these 3 poems. As I said, on the other hand, there are 8 that appear in none of these locations. And I do want to really highlight that they are in the book that just came out in October. So I'm not in any way claiming they are lost or partially hidden. They just have not been emphasized. These are kind of the 8 de-emphasized poems. But let's work with the 3 that are most well known. Let's see what they have in common. And let's see what impression of Sutzkever in Africa do they leave us with. How am I doing on time? Okay, I do have time. I'm going to read probably 2 of them because they're very short. So this is the first one, All Rushing, All Sounds, and I am going to read from Connor's translation of it. So it reads, all rushing, all sounds sleep. Terror sleeps under 7 streams, and the elephant sleeps such a sleep that someone could hack off his tail. All rushing, all sounds sleep. There is no axe to wake them. All rushing, all sounds sleep in the 2 open eyes, sleep in the 2 open eyes of God. And the Yiddish text I have on the screen is from the scan from the Yiddish Book Center. So the exact orthography is a little bit different. It was corrected into the new book. Actually, I will skip past it so we don't run short on time, but this is At the Nile. And that's the opening stanza of Elephants by Night. Elephants by Night is a longer poem. It is also, it became the title for Kolker's folios. It became the title for this book. The elephants become really important. They're kind of the hallmark that everyone knows these by. So what do they have in common? As you can see here, all 3 poems involve water. They either have a non-specific water-based location or at the Nile. They're at the Nile, but the Nile is a really long river. And Sutzkever was able to see kind of the origins of where it would begin, but at the Nile, he's very much invoking biblical imagery, which would have been in a different location. So I'm terming that a mutable location. There are animals in every poem, with the elephant being the most important one. And there's a mystical or religious or transformative event in each poem, as well as the threat of danger. If I was going to write a formula or recipe for Sutzkever in Africa, it's going to include these elements right here. So I would argue that these 3 poems have become the primer, really, through which we read the rest of Sutzkever's African poetry, or at least how we have historically. And perhaps that is part of what makes the specific locations less important. These are moments of wonder from a poet for whom external and internal wonder are permeable ecologies. Now, I've been operating from the position that making an anthology is not simply a curatorial practice, but it is interpretive remixing. So when poems like these 3 poems specifically appear across multiple collections, they've accrued the weight of some representational authority. They become what Africa means within the symbolic register of Sutzkever's work. Repetition is, of course, not neutral, so it constructs a poetic canon within the larger cycle, favoring certain modes of myth-making or ecological encounter over others. And here's where the logic of the placeholder versus the place returns. Poems less frequently selected may confirm or complicate our understanding of what Africa means when we're attending to Africa as the actual place in all. So when I began this project, I had a feeling I was going to be working with these poems for a very long time. There are too many questions. Even as Connor's complete collection of translation and Cammie's excellent contextualization has provided some important grounding, I must admit that some of Sutzkever's most evocative images flicker on the edge of the symbolic, refusing to settle into a concept of place. What I've come to understand is that editorial and translational remixing, the choices made by Kolker, by the Harshops, by Connor, and even by Lethwich, have a significant role in defining how I have received Sutzkever's mythopoetic engagement with Africa. The complexity and relative reality of the imprint left by Africa becomes intensified or diffused depending on which poems are selected, how they are framed, and of course, what aesthetic or political lens the author brings. In this sense, the process of translating, repackaging, and receiving these poems acts as a form of symbolic placeholder, just as Sutzkever was dancing in and out of using Africa as a placeholder itself. These Africa poems open ways for a conversation about ecologies, translation, and anthologizing ethics, representation, and I didn't really get to go into it because I had to cut stuff, but the poetics of mapping. So this is where place, language, and imagination intersect in dislocated and yet enduring ways.
So now we're going to have a little break from academic presentations. So for the next 4 minutes, I'm going to show a couple, the trailer and then a short clip from the film Wer wird bleiben, Who Will Remain, which is a production of the Yiddish Book Center and grew out of the Yiddish Book Center's Wexler Oral History Project. So I'm going to show these 2 clips, and then also I'll put in the chat a link. The film is now available for streaming, so if you haven't seen it yet, I encourage you to, and to let me know what you think.
Sutzkever hat geschaffen ein sehr, sehr, sehr reiche Gesamtwerk von Poesie, welche bezieht sich zu alles. Und ich glaube, für mich ist der Shakespeare von Jiddisch.
The sun and the mountains and the grass, everything was talking to him. He looked at the world from a different view. I went to Vilnius and I had the diary of my grandfather. Everything that he had written in the diary, I tried to fill in. אז מה היה הסיפור? רווחים בתוך הפאזל הזה. Because of his will to write only in Yiddish, Not so many people know his work. I feel that they missed a great writer. I'm going to be a candle of remembrance. I'm going to bring his story to the Israel audience.
Der Tate hat geschrieben im Ghetto. Ist ein Lied mit einem Wort, wo es der Wort und die Lied machen in der Musik.
Sutzkever believed that poetry was vital. Why is he not better known?
hat so viel gegeben der Sprache allein.
אי אפשר להבין, הוא צודק. לשרוד פה, אנחנו לא מדברים על יום-יומיים.
תראו שהיום את הרחוב הזה חוצה כביש מהיר.
מה האמת? מה האמת? פתאום איזשהו סימן שאני... לא יודעת, שהוא איתי.
Okay, so that's the trailer, and then I'm just going to share with you all another clip from the film itself. One thing I thought that I could offer when given this invitation is to actually bring Sutzkever's voice into this space. So here's a section where we're hearing directly from him.
Wer wird bleiben? Was wird bleiben? Bleiben wird a Traf. Breisch ist die Karois zu großen wider den Beschaff. Bleiben wird a Fiedelreus, der Kovet sich allein. 7 Großen von die Großen werden sie verstehen. Ich will sie erlauben zu bringen etliche eigene Gedanken und Aphorismen wegen Dichtung. Dichtung befreit den Menschen von innerlicher Versklavung. Der Pfarr ist leichter zu gehen zum Tod mit einem Lied. Poesie heißt, befreien sich von den Emotionen und auch viele befreien sich von der Persönlichkeit. Aber befreien sich durch Dichtung von der Persönlichkeit kann nur eine dichterische Persönlichkeit. Was wäre der Poet realistisch, als weiter ist von der Realität? Und was mehr der Poet ist fantastisch, als nennt ist zu der Realität.
So next up, we have Kate Brackney, assistant professor of history at Leiden University. She's the author of Surreal Geographies, A New History of Holocaust Consciousness, which came out in 2024 and was awarded the first first book prize from the University of Wisconsin Press. Before coming to Leiden, she taught at the Posen Center for Human Rights at the University of Chicago and Harvard College's History and Literature program. She holds a PhD from Yale University.
Okay. I'll just go ahead and jump right in. So this talk is called Beyond Bearing Witness, Oceans, Ethers, and Hybrid Creatures in Early Art and Literature of Holocaust Remembrance. This is a talk drawn from my book, the first chapter of my book, Surreal Geographies. In the early 1950s, when Avrom Sutzkever looked back on the Nazi occupation of Vilna, the color palette of his memory was green. His series of prose poems, Grüne Aquarium, is a symbolist meditation on Sutzkever's experiences in the Vilna ghetto and as a partisan in the nearby forests. When the poetic narrator of Green Aquarium wonders if it might be possible to see everyone who he lost in Vilna once again, he experiences a vision. And I won't read all of this, I'll read selections. Quote, a green knife slit open the earth. It became green, green, the green of dark fir trees through a mist, the green of cabbage leaves and splinters of dew, the green of a half moon, seen with green eyes from under a wave, and the joyous green of grass bordering a grave. Greens float into greens, body into body, and the earth stands transformed into a green aquarium. Closer, come closer to the green whirlpool. I look in. People swim here like fish. Countless phosphorus faces. The poet Sutzkever's early life was marked by historic calamities that destroyed his Jewish community, including exile to Siberia during World War I and later the Holocaust. To memorialize these events, Benjamin Harshav explains that Sutzkever resorted to a poetic pantheon for the dead, quote, a denial of realism as a way to assert the subsistence of an annihilated world in some cosmic space. Sutzkever ascribed an almost magical capacity to poetry and aspired to write words that, quote, both God and the dead would like to read. Green Aquarium meditates on the possibility of communicating with this imagined audience through fantastic symbols. While Sutzkever was perhaps the most talented Yiddish writer of the 20th century, the most famous Yiddish speaker to write about the Holocaust remains Elie Wiesel, whose memoir Und die Welt hat geschwiegen was edited in French as La Nuit or Night. Formulating cosmic visions that deny realism was not the project of what are now the most widely circulated memoirs and diaries to memorialize the Holocaust. By the late 1950s, Wiesel's Night, Primo Levi's If This Is a Man, and Anna Frank's Diary were already in international circulation. These works established documentation and realism as a predominant aesthetic of Holocaust memory. Later, in the realm of poetry, one of the most famous works to memorialize the Holocaust would be Hebrew poet Dan Pagas's Written in Pencil in the Sealed Railway Car, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The poem achieves its devastating power through a minimalist reversion to silence in the face of broken biblical traditions. These canonical aesthetic approaches to Holocaust remembrance, that is, realism, minimalism, and fragmentation, they have their own important history. But that's not the canon that I will discuss today. Sutzkever certainly shared with some of those writers a commitment to documenting Nazi crimes against Jews. At the Nuremberg trials, he gave terse and wrenching testimony on behalf of Soviet Jews, detailing the murder of his mother and newborn son. But by the time Green Aquarium was published, Sutzkever was turning to poetry to do something other than bear witness or lament over shattered literary traditions. What do we make of his phosphorus faces? And why does the imagery of Green Aquarium seem to clash with what has since become the transnational canon of Holocaust memory? When I teach Sutzkever's prose poem, or when I show students this much later image, which is a self-portrait donated to Yad Vashem by survivor Elsa Susanna Langer, my students get a little taken aback. Is this what Holocaust memory is supposed to look like? Langer's uncanny painting seems more redolent of the expressionist movement associated with the lead up to World War I and its aftermath, not the Holocaust. What my book argues is that these images are not outliers. The artists I examine with Sutzkever in the early post-war period, including Paul Celan, Anna Longfuss, Emile Goboa, Marc Chagall, Yehuda Bakon, among others, they all drew on surreal imagery, symbolism, or hallucinatory realism to imagine interim worlds for bodies that were never buried. The first chapter of my book, which this talk is based on, traces the dimensions of otherworldly spaces, aquariums, graves in the air, lost shores, which Jewish artists represented with great frequency in literature and painting from the mid-1940s to the early 60s, across a variety of national contexts. I examine the literary aspects of their visual work and the visual vocabulary of their literature. The chapter highlights lesser-known representations of the Holocaust while also reinscribing more canonical works like Celan's into an alternative surreal tradition of remembrance. So what do I mean by this term surreal, and how does this post-war artwork of mourning relate to interwar modernism, specifically the surrealist movement? According to its foremost manifesto artist, André Breton, surreality was a utopian union of estranged worlds, the rational mind and its dreams. Surrealist aesthetics were characterized by indeterminate watery form, literalization of metaphor, and the replacement of conscious authorship by processes like automatic writing, language games, and possession. The post-war Jewish refugee artists discussed in this chapter of my book were also concerned with the union of estranged worlds, and they affected this union by turning to dreams and the liminal spaces of oceans and ethers. While Breton linked the formal experimentation of surrealism to the possibility of radical politics, most of the artworks I feature do not trace gateways into a new political future. Over the course of their careers, the artists themselves expressed political commitments across a wide left-right spectrum, but what links together their works, I think, is a concern for the past, rather than a unified vision of rebuilding Jewish and European politics for the future. These artists turned to surreal techniques, not just to commemorate the dead, but to address them and to remain in community with a world they had lost. All of the artists in this chapter imagined their murdered loved ones as living on in some way, not always in the form of angels, but often more earthly, fish or fowl, breathing underwater or hovering in a semi-transcendent space between earth and sky. Conversely, artists who survived the war often figured themselves at the lip of the sea, on the other side of the aquarium, or loosened from the weight of their own bones, suspended just outside of the body, watching the post-war world go on without them. Art historian Sidra Stitch has written that, quote, the dynamic between life and death was paramount to surrealist figuration, citing many interwar paintings featuring humanoid bone fragments atop barren landscapes, which serve as relics of a ruined past. Hybrid forms combining human and animal were also a dominant motif. Stitch cites Max Ernst's bird humans, anthropomorphic insects, and the bull humans of the surrealist magazine Minotaur, which is pictured here. This interest in ruins and the lines between life and death, human and animal, stemmed from World War I, with battles that rendered huge stretches of Europe's landscape into graveyards littered with human remains. Stitch notes that during the interwar period, there was an increasing anthropological fascination with the artifacts and animal dress in non-Western rituals that summoned the other world. She asserts, however, that rather than raising the dead, surrealist artists were more interested in revealing the brutal animal nature of humanity itself. One difference between World War I and the Holocaust was that many Jewish refugees had no access to burial sites where they might mourn. The Nazis took pain to erase evidence of mass graves, and Jews who fled Eastern Europe, never to return, lost access also to pre-war cemeteries. In poetry, writers like Sutzkever and Celan turned to surreal imagery to navigate an agonizing question. In the absence of burial, how do we understand where the dead remain? And from what position can we address them? Like the interwar surrealists, the artists in this chapter were deeply interested in experimenting with the almost talismanic power of language and form. What distinguishes them is that when artists like Sutzkever and Chagall use hybrid animal figures, they aim not just to show the degradation of man, but to represent and maintain a kind of intimacy with those who they lost. In his preface to If This Is a Man, Primo Levi wrote that among survivors, quote, the need to tell our story to the rest, to make the rest participate in it, became for us an immediate and violent impulse, to the point of competing with our other elementary needs. The Jewish artists featured here turned to fantasy and dream imagery, arguably to address another kind of need. Without the possibility of burial, poets and artists transform the bodies of the dead into elaborate topographies to imagine where these earthly spirits might linger on, with or without rest. The hybrid figures and liminal spaces in their works convey an enduring sense of proximity to the dead. Hannah Polangalai has written that Sutzkever's mode of witnessing in the wake of the Holocaust was markedly intersubjective, emphasizing dialogue between himself and other survivors. Green Aquarium engages in a similar dialogic mode, this time not just with other witnesses, but with the lost themselves. In one vignette from Green Aquarium, which describes partisan fighting in the swamps, the poet, reunites with his lost lover, whom he finds when he rips into the hollow of a tree. In this kind of crypt, dead bodies do not give away to an afterlife. Instead, they remain close to the living by becoming amphibious. The lover in this episode has been unrecognizably transformed within the tree, but eventually she uses a sign, her ruby ring, to make herself known to the poet. Quote, "A figure appeared among the tall skinned birches, like a tree transformed into a human being. First pupils of the eyes formed, salty amber fresh from the sea. A moment later, a disheveled head and a crown of thorns, a snake around its neck, the clothes over the body frayed, shredded into dangling tatters. Among them, an uncovered body in poppy red stains. Hey, who are you? The bride of the Swamp King?" The snake around the neck shook its head no. The figure drew closer, and suddenly, from its left hand, there sparkled the ring with the blood drop of the ruby. Later, Green Aquarium conjures a transfigured image of Sutzkever's real-life encounters with men who survived the Holocaust in Vilna's sewers. A vignette describes poor Bomka, who, quote, "after a year in darkness, emerged into the liberated city like a citizen of Pompeii, coated by lava with melted diamonds." In this post-Diluvian world, the city is smashed into bits that still shine with the life that only just left them. Facing Bomka, quote, "like the trough of a dried-up riverbed with the sandy silver of dead fish, lies too broad a street without a single house at its edge." For literary theorist Eric Santner, the concept of the uncanny is crucial for understanding the hypnotic power of destroyed cityscapes, a power that lies in what Santner calls their undeadness. Sutzkever's beached fish that glint in streets where all other signs of life have been erased, his bride of the Swamp King, and poor Bomka, who hid in the sewers and emerged with the pressurized diamond remains of Pompeii. All of these figures appear in scenes that take the structure of Freud's uncanny. A person or place from a former life reappears in a new or disguised form, inhabiting an ambiguous line between life and death. In psychoanalysis, the uncanny is a source of fear and anxiety. However, in Sutzkever's encounters with these ghosts, fear is not the mood that ultimately predominates. Instead, he uses poetic language to take up the ruins of Vilna, encasing them tenderly in an augur of silver, green, and red that preserves the dead in a state of suspended animation. In the end, while so many of the characters in Green Aquarium are hybrids, they do not conform to Santner's models of the creaturely per se. Instead, the liminal spaces and fantastic bodies in Green Aquarium take on a function similar to snow in Sutzkever's early poem, Siberia. Poetry illuminates and preserves the graves he cannot visit in the cities and forests of Lithuania. Sutzkever's glinting fish in the dried-up riverbed of history might also read as an inversion of Marc Chagall's Time is a River Without Banks, a painting that centers on a winged herring that soars with a grandfather clock over a luminous blue world. Fish, roosters, and calves were recurring figures in Chagall's paintings, much of which focused on the Jewish world of Vitebsk. The winged herring appears again in many different instances in Jewish art. Here we see it in Naftali Bezem's memorial relief sculpture at Yad Vashem, signifying the biblical flood, suffocation, and exile. Soaring fish also appear along with many brightly colored animals in Pauline's reconstruction of the cupola in the Wojciech synagogue, one of many wooden synagogues that were scattered across Poland before the war. Animality has long been a metaphor for physical degradation and brutality in the Nazi camp system, but in the poetry and art examined here, wings and fish scales register meanings that are not always grotesque. At times, the blurred line between human and beast even signals semi-transcendence. Consider Chagall's post-war image, Our House in My Village. As Harshav has pointed out, the lithograph draws from an etching Chagall first made in 1922, Grandfather on the Roof, based on a comic anecdote he used to tell about his grandfather disappearing during the holidays to warm himself by the chimney. Like Sutzkever, Chagall developed a distinct visual idiom early in his career that he repeated as extraordinary historical upheavals, like the Russian Revolution and the Holocaust, transformed and destroyed his homeland. A year after the Nazi invasion of France, Chagall and his wife Bella escaped to the United States. His wife died there in 1944, and he returned to Europe in 1948. Throughout that period, and over the length of his painting career, we see men and women, roosters, calves, fish, and clocks defying the laws of gravity and twisting toward the sky according to the logic of some surreal centripetal force. In this post-war lithograph, the fading blue frame seems to represent a similar skyward plane, but at a further level of abstraction, this time with less motion and life. The artist inscribes himself, both inside and outside of this etching of a house in Liozno, bowing his head under a moon that hangs in the blueness. A character from Chagall's early paintings, the rooster, rises like smoke out of the internal frame toward the moon, perhaps a ritual figure referring to the custom of caparot. The rooster could also be an afterimage of Chagall's grandfather, rendered into something other than an angel, an old bird without flight, who balances delicately at the edge of past and present. These semi-transcendent images from Vitebsk appear too in the poetry of Paul Celan, whose work produces extraordinary reflections of Sutzkever or Chagall. Incidentally, Todesfuge, probably the most famous poem to memorialize the Holocaust. This early poem first appeared with illustrations by the Viennese surrealist Edgar Genet, with whom Celan worked after the war before his move to Paris. The frontispiece of that early collection, Der Sand aus den Urnen, which is pictured here, depicts an anthropomorphic rock formation rising out of a cracked landscape. In the foreground, a lily pad, which is typically an aquatic plant, blooms out of the stone ground. I talk at length about Todesfuge in the book. I'll skip that discussion here. Instead, I want to examine a later poem, Hüttenfenster, or Hut Window, from the 1963 collection Die Niemandsrose. Celan describes here an angel with a blistered ankle who paces the earth, from destroyed Vitebsk to Eden and the ghetto. An angel who pulls down the constellations while gathering up the fragments of holy letters, fragments which, quote, he, the human, needs for a dwelling. This poem is emblematic of much of Celan's other work, which conjures up ethers made of heterogeneous elements, light, breath, ash, earth, molten metals. In that angel with a blistered ankle, I think we see a close relative of Chagall's winged fish, and another image from Sutzkever's aquarium, which is the honeybee with a human soul, who visits the poem and inspires him with his sting. These are all semi-transcendent hybrids who mix celestial and terrestrial, wandering between earth and sky on surreal terrains of morning. In the end, in Hut Window, as so often in Celan's poetry, out of an entropic, Kabbalistic swirl, the world is finally reestablished in an intimate encounter with a you who goes unnamed but exerts a grounding pressure in Celan's dizzying semantic experiments. Indeed, many of the artists presented here address themselves to a palpable you, which I think distinguishes their work from interwar surrealism, which was generally more oriented toward the self's repressed id. The second person address often inscribes the artist or poet into an intimate community, though not necessarily a community of the present. Given the importance of the I-thou relationship in 20th century Jewish thought and theology, these artists raise the question of how to construct intersubjectivity at the threshold between not just man and God or man and the other, but between the living and the dead. Thank you.
So now we're going to turn to Anna Elena Torres, Assistant Professor in Comparative Literature at the University of Chicago, Torres is the author of Horizons Blossom, Borders Vanish, Anarchism and Yiddish Literature, published by Yale University Press in 2024, and is co-editor of With Freedom in Our Ears, Histories of Jewish Anarchism, published by University of Illinois Press in 2023. Torres's publications include work in proof texts, Jewish Quarterly Review, Nashim, Makeshift, a journal of feminisms in motion, Ingeveb, and Arts Everywhere. Torres's creative practice has included work as a poet and translator, community arts organizer, muralist, and conceptual artist exhibited at the Venice Biennale's Yiddishland Pavilion in 2022 and at the Polin Museum in Warsaw.
Thank you so much to Christa and all the panelists. The paper I'm going to read from is an excerpt from a book manuscript in progress about animality in Yiddish literature, with particular interest in images of multi-species kinship. Here is a map of the chapters to give you a sense of where the Sutzkever part of the project is contextualized. The talk I will share today looks at the poetics of animality in Sutzkever's work, particularly images of metamorphosis, and how it functions in moments of survival. As a content warning, I will be citing his and others' witness accounts of wartime. This paper discusses a few animal categories in his oeuvre: birds, dogs, oxen, tigers, and furs. Birds, and doves in particular, are the most populous species in his verse. Dogs, historically implicated in anti-Jewish violence, appear as both tormentors and occasional comrades. Furs become animist objects in which the spirit of an animal persists after death, sheltering vulnerable human bodies. Taken together, Sutzkever's birds, dogs, and fur are teachers of survival, modeling for the poet how to metamorphose beyond conditions of genocide. These poems structure the relation of survivor to animal as one of kinly alterity. One can survive by becoming animal without becoming predator. In 1941, in the hills near the Vilna ghetto, Sutzkever was forced to dig his grave before a firing squad. He described the moment with a vision of animal beauty, quote, "When they ordered us to put our hands over our eyes, I understood that they were going to shoot us. And I remember, as if it were now, when I put my fingers on my eyes, I saw birds fluttering. I never saw birds flying so slowly. I had a great aesthetic joy in seeing the slow, slow motion of their wings between my fingers." The Lithuanian soldiers shot over their heads instead. Sutzkever describes his anticipated execution as a moment of animal metamorphosis. His bodily sensorium and sense of time are transformed to surreally indeterminate effect. Do his fingers become birds? Does his individual subjectivity dissolve? Are his abilities to perceive animal beauty and capacity for, quote, aesthetic joy, the actual poetic defiance which allows him to survive? The idiom "to become an animal" in the context of wartime often means to lose one's humanity, that is, to lose one's ethics. Yet for Sutzkever, to become animal signifies survival through kinship and entanglement with the natural world. Unlike the trope of the genocide survivor whose experience of cruelty turns him animalistic, Sutzkever's invocations of animality are ennobling. When the poet becomes animal, he becomes benevolent, practicing mutual aid as a factor of survival. Such becoming animal is not abasement, but ethical elevation and even spiritual epiphany. Iconoclastically, for a witness of war, Sutzkever embraced the poetics of surrealism, maximalism, and opacity, as Kate Brackney has shown us. This move to opacity and radical alterity expresses an ethical stance against enclosure or capture of the other. Centering animality foregrounds an ecological relation not based in a particular political territory. Animals roam through these poems as unknowable, border-free others and apparitions of the sublime. This poetic encounter with animals as uncapturable others counters the Nazi ideology of nature as violent but orderly, in Borea Sax's phrase. Nazi identification with predators naturalized murder as a rightful part of biological order, projecting fascist hierarchy into the lives of animals. In 1934, for example, Hitler wrote that, quote, "I desire a violent, domineering, fearless, and ferocious upcoming generation. The free and magnificent predator must once again glint from their eyes." Lahavdol, Sutzkever's animal poems cultivate a continuous state of awe without assimilating animals into human systems of domination or justifying human power through identification with predators. Sutzkever's poetic regard for the opacity of animals, which functions also as a cipher for the unknowability of the other, protects the subject against vulnerability to ideologies of domination. Perceiving the animal elicits the poet's full presence and creative attunement. Poetic recognition of the opacity of animals is thus made an amulet against ideology. Dogs were instrumentalized in the Nazi genocide and in the United States and South Africa to enforce apartheid, as Benedict Boisseron catalogues in her book Afro Dog. In Sutzkever's early Siberian memory poems, dogs appear pulling sleds through the snow with flying bells. The animal returns in his ghetto poems, then instrumentalized for horror. Sutzkever's literary accounts of dog attacks echo many witness testimonies, including his own 1946 statement at the Nuremberg trial, where he was prevented from testifying in Yiddish, which was not considered an official language. At the trial, Sutzkever described how, quote, "the manhunters of the Sonderkommandos tracked hiding Jews with police dogs. Trained dogs are described as prosthetics of the police, who weaponize their powerful senses of smell." Sutzkever testifies to the forced animalization of prisoners. Quote, "Murer, when he visited the ghetto, went into shops where Jews were working for him and ordered all the workers to fall down on the ground and bark like dogs." Sutzkever relates the failed weaponization of dogs on Yom Kippur in 1941, using a vocabulary of predation. Quote, "Schweichenberg began to shoot at the inhabitants of the ghetto. I remember that there was a big dog at his side, and when this dog heard the shots, it jumped at Schweichenberg and began to bite his throat like a mad dog. Then Schweichenberg killed this dog and told the Jews to bury it and to cry over its grave. We really cried then. We cried because it was not Schweichenberg, but the dog that had been buried." In his Nuremberg testimony, the Nazi's dog absorbs the anti-Jewish violence which ends its life. Images of a sacrificial dog echo through Sutzkever's work, including his three-part poem, A Day in the Hands of the Stormtroopers, written in the Vilna Ghetto in May 1942. As in his description of the near execution, where his hands become birds, the speaker disassociates from his embodied perception of time and transforms his body. Quote, "These limbs are not mine like an hour that's passed. Reality has no grip on my body. It is like a retelling of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, in which the child sacrifice is replaced at the last minute by Abraham slaughtering a lamb instead. Here the Sonderkommando manhunters kill the dog instead. The sacrificial dog persists through his howl, which haunts the survivor's psyche." In the story Yanina and the Animal in Green Aquarium, which Kate Brackney has also just spoken about this text, another dog-like creature is sacrificed in place of a person. Quote, "In the middle of the pond, away from the snowdrifts, the enemy suddenly rose up before us, and with legs that had turned into animals, und mit Fies was seinen geworden chayes, I dash among the bullets, ever closer to the pine trees on the other shore. Look now, a wolf, a green wolf, shooting sparks with its shadow in its teeth, chasing us both, and now he's leaped up onto the boy who's clamped around my neck. But in that blink of an eye, it sounds like a Bible story, via Meisele von Tanach. As the wolf was coming through the air, the foe's bullet smashed its skull." And I'm citing here the translation by Zachary Schollenberger, which came out recently in 2020. Again, at the moment of near execution, the human is transformed through the act of regarding a non-human animal. The green wolf shooting sparks with its shadow in its teeth seemingly bursts from memory into myth, but as with his other moments of poetic near-death, the human, or their feet or their fingers, is transformed into an animal and the animal into a sacrifice. What is the space between testimony and poem? Is this a retelling of the same memory of the sacrificed dog, which he told to stenographers at Nuremberg? Has the dog become a green wolf at the moment of execution as the man becomes a bird? Death of an Ox is a rare anthropomorphizing vignette in Green Aquarium. The ox appears with burning horns, 2 crooked wax candles, under a radiant yellow halo. He hears mooing but cannot speak, mouth open but he lost his tongue, hot verloren die Zunge. His senses are profusely disoriented in a kaleidoscope of light and color, quote, and with his double vision elliptical eyes like multicolored melted glass, he sees another ox in the water, upside down, with its burning horns facing into its sky. Does a human smile appear on his face? Which way is upright? How do these candle horns burn underwater? Does the human smile replace human speech? Can an ox lose the ability to speak human language to begin with? Or is the lost tongue a mythic Yiddish? Ruth Weiss observes, among the most affecting poems in Green Aquarium are those that invest animal life with the same heightened human value. Remarkably enough, Sutzkever's real season in hell, rather than inducing conclusions of nihilism and despair, served to sharpen his moral concentration. The nobility of the dying ox projects a controlled but exalted commemorative vision of the martyred Jews of Europe. Reading the dying oxen as a metaphor for the destruction of Jewish life perhaps reduces the animal's alterity while it expands fellow feeling beyond the human. The ox has, quote, dried dung stuck to its hindparts, an image of abjection, if read symbolically, which seemingly contradicts what Ruth Weiss reads as, quote, an exalted commemorative vision. His horns, double halos which evoke Shabbat candlesticks, then become deathbed candles, calling to mind yahrzeit candles. The kaleidoscopic image of the dying ox flickers in and out of religious illusion, ambivalently but defiantly. How do his horns burn through water, flaming upside down in a world without a right side up? The ox is further anthropomorphized, even Judaized, in his nostalgia, turning his gaze, quote, to his home village where only a dark chimney like a dead hand remains. The oxen are both mourning animals and grievable subjects. These upside down oxen recall Chagall's oxen paintings, in which the flayed ox is inverted, perhaps to drain the blood, as for the shochet, a kosher slaughterer. In an earlier painting by Chagall, the ox lounges rather loosely, while a human figure floats above, inverted. There are several other Chagall paintings of oxen, which Sutzkever's symbolist vignette evokes. And so you can see here in Chagall as with Sutzkever, this image of the candle burning at the top of the frame and the oxen upside down. The prose poem In Memory of a Fur, Zum Undank von a Pelzel, apostrophizes and elegizes a childhood object which travels with him across life and geography. It begins, Beim Werne Pelzel bist du verbliebene Schäffele. In becoming a fur, you remained a lamb. When my mother ransomed you from 100-year-old Kyrgyz for a pouch of salt and surprised me with the gift on my 7th birthday, it was as if my mother's breath had entered my bones, as though I had donned a living piece of the sun. Sutzkever describes a series of exchanges. The lamb becomes a fur while remaining a lamb, and his mother throws her breath into his bones as he dons the pelt like a piece of the sun. The densely layered fur embodies a series of kinships and encounters, real or imagined, between the Jewish child and the elderly Kyrgyz man, between the lamb's body and the boy's skin. The sun is no less animate than fur. After the catastrophe, Sutzkever returns to the radiant memory of boyhood Siberia, never embittered as a site of exile. His elegy for the sheep who became a sheepskin describes the transmigration or gilgul of material life. The boy takes on the appearance of a lamb himself, wrapped in fur, The prose poem describes how he must have appeared to a passing horse rider, quote, a blue lamb lost in eternity. In memory of a fur circulates and transforms the images of Sibir, including the portrait of mutuality between ethnic minorities. The persistence of animal life through its fur is reversed in Zu a Tiger, to a tiger. The closing poem in Helfanden bei Nacht, Elephants at Night, here in the translation by Mel Konner, which Rachel Martin also referred to this same book of translations. The collection teems with multi-species life: termites, locusts, elephants, lions, flamingos, oxen, golden birds. The poem portrays an encounter, beginning, "Wir haben plötzlich sich der Zen. Die Zeit ist nicht geworden, hast bewacht dem Teuer von Ganeden. Über der zwei Wasserfallen strömen dicke Fliegel. Bruder, hast mein Blick von schweren Blei zerschmutzen dein feierdicken Mildkeit. Pardon, es hat mir abgetane Spitzel. Nicht der Losen, deine Lippen sollen mich versuchen." And you have the rest of Mel Konner's translation on the screen. The poem To a Tiger recollects a journey once he has returned home, presumably to Tel Aviv. It is a poem of inversions. The tiger appears as an angelic guardian of the Garden of Eden, which has seemingly migrated to South Africa. Wild tigers are not native to Africa, and only in the final rhyme and couplet do we see that they are behind bars. Both speaker and tiger, then, seem to be out of place. Although their relation would normally be one of predator and prey, the poet hails the tiger with reverence, Bruder, brother. The speaker longs to be consumed, not buried in deterritorialized land or, quote, lying foolish in the soil, but to gurgle, gerieselt, the blood of a tiger. Sutzkever uses the common word erd, earth, deflating the epic register afforded to soil in Eretz Yisrael, where some religious Jews aspire to be buried. Like the fur sacrificed to protect the small boy in Siberia, he longs for metamorphosis, even through death. To a Tiger maintains the ecstatic register of his early work, with its waterfall tiger wings and rapturous gaze held by a beast. Justin Kemi, however, reads To a Tiger as an ironic disavowal of Sutzkever's earlier nature euphoria. Kemi remarks on Sutzkever's, quote, post-war skepticism toward the possibility of a genuine return to nature, by juxtaposing the naturalist image of the human body, of the human being reduced to mere dirt, against the romanticized image of life in a vibrant animal body. Sutzkever ridicules the hypocrisy of the way in which we imagine that the cycles of life preserve what we deem precious and noble about humans. I depart from Kami's ironic reading of To a Tiger, as I wish to account for its unresolved last lines of shared captivity and identification. Returning to what would be thought of as Holy Land, the poet instead mourns the journey, zurück zum Wort dem österlich nicht satten, more literally back to the bizarre word, unsated, österlich. Encountering a powerful animal in the zoo was by then a literary trope, as in Rilke's The Panther of 1902, which poeticizes the exotic zoo at the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. The panther's perception is reduced to an aperture between cage bars, glimpsing the world in slivers of sight. Gazing at the panther reorders the German poet's sense of bodily constraint and serves as colonial metaphor about sight. For Sutzkever's mystic, encountering the cosmically unbounded, water-winged brother tiger was simply not enough if he's still left alive. What kind of animal, then, is the poet? Sutzkever's animal imagery envisions transcendent and intimate affinity between the Yiddish poet and the ecological world. In doing so, he denaturalizes Nazi ideology of predation, which sought to embed fascism into animal biology. In the narrative poem Kernlich Weiz, Kernels of Wheat, the speaker appears as a specifically feminine creature, a comforting hen. Written in the Vilna Ghetto in 1943, it thematizes Sutzkever's efforts to smuggle out Yiddish books. Wie beim Beschitzen an Offel, ich läuf mit dem jiddischen Wort, nicht der in etlichen Hefel, der Geist soll nicht werden der Mord. As a hen shelters a chick, I run with the Yiddish word, rummaging through every courtyard so its spirit won't be murdered. The poetic speaker's salvific act mimics that of the hen's instinctive behavior. Grobich und plants manuskripten. I dig holes and plant manuscripts. The poem shifts into the epic register as kernels of wheat, which would feed barnyard animals, now recall an Egyptian king's storehouses. It ends, und wieder uralter Kern, was hat sich verwandelt in Sang, wollen die Welter euch nähren, wollen die Welter gehören, dem Volk in sein ewigen Gang. And like the ancient seed transformed through its stalk, these words will nourish, these words will belong to the people in their eternal walk. The poet becomes a hen whose gathered word kernels bear wheat to nourish the people. This animal metaphor reflects the testimony of survivors who recall being aided by animals. Timothy Cole quotes the survivor Charlene Schiff, quote, "The animals in the forest were with me. They lent their warmth and they protected me. The dogs were my enemy as much as the humans were." Schiff distinguishes between, quote, "threatening domestic animals and nurturing wild animals." Animals kept walking by, nuzzling. There I saw a bear one time. The only reason I can figure out they didn't touch me is because I smelled like them. I'm sure they thought I was one of them. Not one animal tried to harm me except the stupid dogs in the villages. They would be really vicious. I was bitten a number of times by dogs, but never by an animal in the forest. Sutzkever's ecological visions offer respite from human cruelty by sensing awe for animality. Hybrid creatures roam through his poems, a face-cooing dove, word-salvific hen, sleeping steppe bears, water-winged tiger, green-shadowed wolf, candle-horned oxen, covertly communicative mice, and other transformed beings. Through such surreal testimony, Sutzkever builds a poetic kinship of survival. Thank you.
Now we will turn to a Q&A. So panelists, if you all want to come back on video, you're welcome to. And I encourage everyone, I'll start off just saying some things and offering some questions, but I encourage anyone in the audience to also share questions. So I was struck, Anna, from your introduction, using the quotation from the bean about every bird sings in Yiddish. There's a line in our film, Wer wird bleiben, which is a special favorite to Emily Felder and I, where we both have some connections to geology in various ways, in which Sutzkever says, "As nit nor Vogelgesang, nor euch stumme Steiner hot seir Musik." Not only bird song, but also each mute stone has its music. So you all did some of this, but I'd love to invite you to say more about this more than human characters in the works you've been reading. What happens if you, when you center the voices of these non-human participants of his ecologies? What are they expressing? What is the role of the writer in this interaction, considering that, as far as we know, or at least these non-human participants in the ecologies are not writing poems in the same ways that Sutzkever is. And then I'm curious, as Anna, you introduced in your talk just now, to turn our attention to Sutzkever as an animal himself. So do you see, Sutzkever, not only the writer, but the human, the mammal, the animal interacting with his ecologies in while writing and in the writing itself? Many of you talked about a range of ecologies: physical, destroyed, mythical, metaphorical, imagined places. So I'd really love to hear, and Anna introduced this question at the beginning, how you all are defining ecology in your work. I was also struck by how many of you brought in visual artists, including artistic interpretations of Sutzkever's work. I think this is perhaps encouraged by our format, and trends to include visuals in our presentations slides, but it also placed Sutzkever and us today beyond the oisius, beyond the writing into this multimedia realm. So this brought in for me the human communities, also thinking about the translators present in all of your translations. So if anyone want to talk about that, I mean, I'm sure we've all experienced how reading through various theoretical frameworks changes the way we read the same works. So I'd love to hear more from you all about how centering ecology has changed how you have read Sutzkever's works, as well as perhaps how you think about the human communities that Sutzkever is a part of. And lastly, I'll say, the fact that we're all beaming in here through this gift that is virtual presentations, I'd like to bring in our ecologies as readers. Rachel mentioned that Justin Cami in his afterword of Mel Konner's new translations warns us to suppress our current spatial temporal ecology when reading Sutzkever's Africa poems. But what happens if we don't? Have you experienced, that the ecology within which you are reading changes maybe an animal that you're reading with, or, a tree that you're reading with, or a stone that you're looking at between reading poems changes how you experience Sutzkever's writings? So it's a lot of questions. And I'd love to hear anyone who wants to jump in on any of those, and I can also bring us back to specific questions as we get into the discussion.
I'll just jump in briefly to say on the relationship between word and image and the fact that we're so visual in these presentations on Zoom. That playing with that relationship was a major part of the Surrealist project, and so I didn't mention it here, but another thing I discuss in the chapter is De Traum vom Trauma, which is a collection of Edgar Genet's artworks, which Ceylon provided a kind of dreamy commentary to. And a lot of those illustrations sort of are meld landscape with body in ways that destabilize the relationship between those two things rather than essentializing it, I think. And yeah, that play with the visual elements of literary language and the sort of literary elements of images, I think, was sort of the time. Yeah, and not just of our own time. Okay.
I'm working on putting some of these questions in the chat, but in the meantime, does anyone want to jump in on in response?
I can talk.
Thanks, Rachel.
Oh.
Go ahead.
I can talk a little bit about the inclusion of more than human relatives in the poetry, and one of the things that's just so interesting to me is how everyone is so drawn to the elephants in the African poems, and I don't have a clear answer for myself yet if that's like a bias we're bringing to it because they are so impressive, or if Sutzkever was duly impressed by them, and so that's why they seem to hold such a central or privileged position in the retelling of these poems, because he's also writing about termites. He's also writing about flies, like the variety of animals that are in there. And in some of the interviews that Mel Konner has given about this new book, he talks about the first poem that actually grabbed him out of this cycle was the one about an ox. And to me, there's absolutely nothing particularly African about that. It's just thinking of the relationships I have with animals and which ones I really want to spend time focusing on. I want to highlight something that Eva said that I just absolutely loved. You said you were describing the Siberia poems as an assemblage of life-altering moments. And I was just thinking of that beautiful turn of phrase, this life-altering moments, and how the other actors in those moments weave between the human, the natural, the animal. I just thought that was a really good framing that I wanted to reapply and rethink my whole paper after I heard you say that. Like, how could I put that in my work as well?
So I put some questions in the chat for us panelists, if anyone wants to jump on one of those, or Rachel, you made a great example of also commenting on each other's work or asking questions of each other.
So maybe I will try. I would like to refer to the question that Rachel also answered. The question of voices including different voices of the non-human participants of his Sutzkever's ecology. It was a really nice image, the description that every single non-human has own voice, own music, and I thought that maybe Sutzkever was trying to give these non-human actors their voice, gather them in the realm of poetry, and thereby perceiving the non-human as an autonomous entity, not crossing the boundary of subjectivity of these non-human entities. But there's a lot of images in his poetry, images of trying to get inside to this, to the stone, to the non-human environment, particular elements of environment. So these images, through these images, the poetic subjects tries to cross these boundaries, to transform maybe himself, themselves to non-human entity. So I don't have a clear answer how we can confirm or agree these two approaches to the environment. I think that Sutzkever treat nature as these non-human elements of environment as source of epiphanies. He's trying to capture moments of sudden realization or revelation. So that's why he's trying to get inside the non-human subject, trying to looking for something metaphysical, but that will stand in opposition to to ecology, to his focus on environment. So that's definitely a question, how we can understand this relationship between ecological approach and the metaphysical one, because I think Sutzkever trying combine both. So maybe that just for just a few remarks.
Well, as you're talking about that, the first poem that comes to mind for me is The Meteor in the Kalahari Desert, because that's not even an animal, that's a meteor. But when he goes up to it, when the speaker goes up to it, he says he feels a human glow from it, and then he knocks on it. And so that's just a beautiful weaving of those different perceptions. I do think you're really onto something with labeling it the search for the epiphany. In your talk, you were talking about a sense of strangeness, and I know in my talk I had said a sense of wonder, and I was playing with what the distance was between strangeness and wonder for our conversation.
On the sort of method of approaching epiphany, I was struck by I think multiple panelists noted that Siberia is not depicted as a place of exile and degradation or torture. It's this, sentimental space of memory. And similarly, the ways that the animal is depicted in this occupied territory is not always as, predatory as in human, which would have been an almost sort of cliche of, philosophical reflection on the Nazi occupation. Instead, he's looking at these animals which are becoming sort of vehicles for human souls and are becoming vehicles for his own memory, right? And I don't necessarily. I like the term that Ruth Weiss uses, this sort of moral clarification. I don't think it's sentimental necessarily, or this idea that we have to triumph over there's this sort of triumph of the human spirit. I don't necessarily see that. Instead, the sort of unexpected association, right? Again, that would have been a surrealist technique, putting two concepts or images or words together that don't seem to make sense together, and then using that contradictory image to sort of break through into some kind of new sort of vision or concept, right? So it's a kind of practice that opens up sort of imaginative spaces. So, and I was struck by that, and the sort of unexpected uses of Siberia, the unexpected uses of animals in wartime. It seems not coincidental, but like a method almost.
Yeah, thank you as well for all your talks. I think I really have a lot of new inspiration for reworking mine, and yeah, as I think to the question of Rachel about why the elephants are so popular, or I also wouldn't know why, but I think in the cycle itself, there's so many kind of moments where we can also empathize or see ourselves in the beings, like the termites that or the locusts that eat up everything, despite their smallness. And so yeah, I think they are kind of appealing to us as readers. And how do I define ecology? I think seeing what is talked about now, like in the field of ecology or philosophy of ecology, like trying to not view the world as separateness, but as togetherness. But I think also in Sutzkever's work, we always have this reflexive aspect.
Yeah, I think one of the tensions perhaps with earlier generations of Sutzkever scholars, such as Justin Cami and Ruth Weiss, where they were intensely close with him in terms of their friendship. And now it's a different generation, and that distance represents loss, but also possibility of reading things differently. And I think one way is thinking of the tension between the symbolic reading and the symbolist reading, or thinking about non-teleological ways of reading Sutzkever. For example, Weiss and Cami emphasize, there's a line in Sutzkever about he goes to Jerusalem and quote, every stone is my grandfather, or every stone is my ancestor. And to me, that does not seem so separate from the kind of imminent epiphany that he also finds in Siberia and in these different spaces. And in Suatiger, there's this kind of reversal that the tiger is guarding the Garden of Eden, and somehow the Garden of Eden is not being found in the Middle East, it's being found in Africa. So I still see this kind of diasporic Spinozist euphoria pervading these different geographies. And then in terms of the symbolist, as in the French literary movement, versus the symbolic, that is reading an animal as a symbol of virtue or some other quality, I'm interested in thinking about Chagall there as well. And it's interesting to me that Rachel's presentation is thinking with very different abstract, far less representative images whose imagination is entangled with Sutzkever. and for Kate as well, bringing in these other artworks. Where is kind of the line or the movement between the symbolic reading and the symbolist reading? And I think with Sutzkever, it's not that it's absent of Jewish imagery. Certainly, I think I've tried to emphasize the image of the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac, and the image of the candles that are burning on the oxen. But I think there's also something which exceeds that. There's something symbolist that exceeds the symbolic, which is also present. And that's something that I'm still thinking about in terms of non-teleological geographies in Sutzkever. And I'm also just very interested in the fact that we had, 5 different emerging scholars, junior scholars, working on Sutzkever in new ways and thinking about other approaches to ecology.
A final thought on how to define ecology. Who is included in this ecology and what kind of landscapes overlap or intersect with each other in this ecology? And I really appreciated the image of the palimpsest, also as a way of thinking of otherworldliness and the world of the dead, the way it's proximate, the way it breaks through a honeybee who, stings the poet's heart. And what would it mean too to be accountable to non-human lives, animal lives, but also to the dead as well, that kind of expansive notion of an ecology that is both physical and metaphysical, right? How I feel like I'm in an unclear way trying to gesture towards a kind of moral clarity that might come out of a Sutzkeverian ecology, which includes all of these different webs of relations, right? But what would it mean to have a kind of ethical vision that connects all of those planes and beings together?
Not in any way trying to downplay the presence of the dead, who are very much alongside Sutzkever in so many of his poems. But I'm almost wondering how could we bring in vibrant materialism, thinking about kind of that shimmering importance of the objects themselves and him as a non-prioritized object within the ecology. Something in that connects for me. But I like what you're saying about how many networks and webs he is weaving together of these systems.
Yeah, and it's often such a fluid system. Like I referred to just one of the poems about a fur, but there are so many poems where people are putting on furs, or there's some kind of Gilgal. There's another one of the ghetto poems called Dr. Atlas, and there's this image of the surgeon is operating on I think a non-Jewish patient who's smoking a pipe and wearing a fur during the operation. And he's described as growing a calf out of his back. And so again, we have this transformation in which putting on a fur transforms a person into the animal, or the animal recognizes a person wearing a fur as a fellow animal. So for me, thinking with Sutzkever and glissant is really interesting, thinking about opacity or a non-reciprocal alterity. And also Levinas writing on the dog. There's a passage in Levinas's autobiographical essays where he encounters this dog in the camp, and the dog is always happy to see him and the other prisoners. And he says, the dog was the last Kantian in Europe. And so I think thinking about Levinas and glissant together with Sutzkever could be an interesting way also of opening up the ethical dimension.
That transition between the human and the animal happens in Elephants by Night, the poem. There's women at the river. They remove their masks. Well, they're elephants and they remove their masks. They become women, and one of them is stolen as a bride by stealing her ability to change back. That's the most oblique example of it in it, but it's that moving between theme just really, really in your face in that form, though. and it's accompanied with violence, like that aloneness and the risk that comes from not being able to change back.
We have just a couple minutes left. Does anyone have any closing thoughts or comments as we head towards closing this session?
Maybe just like a question for future work of mine. Does anyone have like the leader volume, or did anyone come across it? Because I couldn't find it, but maybe one of you knows where it is. Okay, then I have to go on an exploration.
Yeah. If you write to the bibliographers at the Yiddish Book Center, they can often help you locate material. Yeah,
Thanks.
David Metzauer, he's wonderful. He's helped me track down things. Christa, I really love your last question about have you experienced the ecology within which you read changing how you experience Sutzkever's writing? And I love that attention to kind of the mutuality. And I'm someone who got really into bird watching during the pandemic. And so the attunement to birds and noticing just how many birds there are that fly through Sutzkever.
Because I encountered the African poems first in a special collection setting, they were very much something I had to go view with the art, with everything, and then walk away from and contemplate. The fact that now we have Connor's translation in a book and I can read them anywhere and I can take them with me is a different experience than something that I could remember, I could photograph, but I couldn't experience except in one place. And that kind of made them special for me.
Anna, do you want to say any words to close us out here?
I have a lot to think about. I love the echoes of entanglement and palimpsest and that language that came up so much. I'm interested in seeing, in previous generations of scholarship, there's been a lot of conversation where diaspora is something that could speak between Yiddish literature across other fields. Particularly Black study, thinking about what is the connection when diaspora is at the center. And if we think about ecology at the center, how does that allow us to form new scholarly or interdisciplinary formations? How might other theorists or other poets resonate when we think about ecology as the connective tissue? So I'm very excited to follow all of your work, and I hope we'll stay in conversation about Sutzkever and beyond.